There is a development in this conflict that the Western press is almost entirely ignoring, and it may turn out to be the most consequential single escalation since the war began. Not because of what it did on the ground. The immediate physical damage, while significant, is not the story because of what it represents strategically, what it reveals about the calculations being made in Tel Aviv, and what it could trigger in a direction that nobody currently discussing this conflict seems prepared to fully reckon with. Israel struck Anzali. And if you are wondering what Anzali has to do with Iran, the answer is that it is not primarily about Iran. Anali is a port city on the Caspian Sea. And the Caspian Sea is not a Middle Eastern waterway, it is Russia's lake. Let that sit for a moment. In the middle of a conflict that has already stretched American military capacity to its limits, fractured the Western alliance, produced the worst single-day American air losses in decades, triggered the deployment of nuclear-capable bombers, and generated an energy crisis affecting hundreds of millions of people. Israel has now struck a major port facility that sits on Russia's most strategically significant inland sea at a location that serves as a critical logistics node for Russian, Iranian, military, and commercial cooperation. This is not a tactical error. It is a strategic declaration, and understanding what it declares and what the response options available to Moscow actually look like is what we are going to walk through in this transmission. Subscribe to Right Now if you are not already subscribed. What we are covering today is the kind of geopolitical analysis that does not exist in Western mainstream coverage in either English or Spanish. This is the full picture. Hit that button and let's go. Let's start with the geography, because geography is the foundation of everything strategic in this situation. The Caspian Sea is the world's largest landlocked body of water. It is bordered by Russia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Azerbaijan. Russia does not merely border the Caspian. It treats the Caspian as strategically sovereign space. Russian naval vessels operate there. Russian military infrastructure surrounds it. The supply corridors that connect Russia to Iran through the Caspian, moving military hardware, commercial goods, energy commodities, and strategic materials in both directions, run through ports that Russia considers part of its own extended security perimeter. Anzali is Iran's most important Caspian port. It handles grain storage, container terminals, military logistics, and joint Iranian-Russian infrastructure that serves as a critical node in the north-south corridor, connecting the Indian Ocean to the Caspian and through to northern Europe. This corridor has become more strategically important to both Russia and Iran as Western sanctions have pushed both countries to develop alternative commercial routes that bypass the dollar-denominated Western financial system. Striking Anzali is not striking an Iranian asset that happens to be near Russian interests. It is striking an asset that is deeply integrated into Russian commercial and military logistics in a body of water that Russia considers its own strategic domain. The question that requires an honest answer is, what was Israel trying to achieve by doing this? The most plausible strategic logic, and it is a logic worth understanding even as we note its extraordinary recklessness, runs as follows. Israel has been unable to decisively defeat Iran militarily despite weeks of intensive operations. Iran's military capacity has not collapsed. Hezbollah in Lebanon is inflicting real costs on Israeli forces. The Houthis in Yemen have closed the Red Sea to Israeli-linked shipping. Iranian strikes have penetrated Israeli air defenses multiple times. The conflict has expanded in ways that have not been favorable to Israeli strategic objectives. And Iran continues to operate because it has supply chains, weapons, technology, intelligence flowing through multiple routes, including the Caspian corridor. One way to interpret the Anzali strike is as an attempt to degrade that supply chain. cut the Caspian logistics node and you complicate the flow of Russian military technology into Iran. You slow down the pipeline that has been feeding Iranian air defense systems, drone components, targeting intelligence, and potentially advanced weapons platforms into the conflict. On pure military supply chain logic, it has a certain coherence. But there is a second interpretation that is harder to dismiss, and it is more alarming. Israel may be deliberately attempting to drag Russia into this conflict, not because Israeli planners believe they can defeat Russia. Obviously, they cannot, but because Russian direct military involvement would activate NATO's Article 5 mutual defense obligation and force the United States, the European alliance, and the entire Western military infrastructure into a full-scale confrontation with Moscow that would dwarf the current Iran conflict and reframe the entire war. In that scenario, everything that has happened in Iran becomes a footnote to a larger civilizational confrontation in which Israel's interests align with Western interests in ways that would make the current Western ambivalence about Israeli military conduct politically unsustainable. That strategic calculation, deliberately provoking Russian intervention to force NATO into the conflict, is not a sign of strength. It is a sign of a country that has concluded it cannot achieve its objectives through its own military power and is attempting to engineer a situation where others fight its existential battles for it. Let's now talk about what Russia actually can do in response to the Anzali strike, because this is the part of the analysis that is entirely absent from Western coverage and that matters most for understanding where this conflict goes next. Russia has not formally responded with military force. That is not because Russia lacks the capability to respond or because the provocation was insufficiently serious. It is because Russia has a range of graduated response options that do not require direct military involvement and that can impose serious costs on Israel without triggering the formal escalation ladder that would come with a direct strike. The first and most immediate option is Syrian airspace. Russia controls the Syrian air defense environment. Russian forces in Syria have the capability to close Syrian airspace to Israeli aircraft, something Moscow has never done despite years of Israeli strikes on Syrian territory. If Russia decides to activate that option, Israeli long-range strike capabilities against targets in Lebanon, Syria, and Iran through Syrian air corridors are immediately constrained. Not eliminated, Israel has other routing options, but significantly complicated and made more costly. The second option, and the one that would change the conflict's trajectory most dramatically, is the delivery of advanced air defense systems to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Currently, Hezbollah operates with a sophisticated missile arsenal, but limited advanced air defense capability. If Russia were to provide S-300 systems to Hezbollah, not the most advanced Russian platforms, just the S-300, northern Israel would immediately become a genuinely contested air environment. Israeli Air Force operations over Lebanon and northern Israel would face a threat profile they have not previously encountered. The north of Israel, which has already proven vulnerable to Hezbollah rocket barges, would become operationally untenable for Israeli air operations in a way that S-300 coverage would make very difficult to address. The third option involves direct weapon supply enhancement to Iran. Russia has already been providing targeting intelligence and military hardware through various channels, as we have documented in previous transmissions. If the Anzali strike crosses a threshold that Moscow decides requires a qualitative response rather than a protest, the quality and quantity of Russian military technology flowing to Iran could increase significantly. Not declared, not formally acknowledged, but operationally consequential in ways that would show up on the battlefield within days or weeks. Beyond these military options, Russia has economic and diplomatic levers that could impose costs on Israel's supporting network. But the military options are the ones that matter most for the immediate trajectory of the conflict. There is a critical backstory here that explains why Israel felt it could strike Anzali without triggering an immediate Russian military response, and why that calculation may be about to be revised. Approximately 2 years ago, Russia offered Iran a formal mutual defense treaty modeled on the agreement it had already signed with North Korea. The structure was explicit. If either party was attacked, the other was obligated to respond militarily. A NATO equivalent for the axis that Washington calls the axis of evil, which the Washington framing reveals, is principally defined by the fact that these countries are not aligned with American interests. Iran said no. Specifically, the liberal faction within the Iranian parliament, influenced by intelligence elements that believed a negotiated return to engagement with the West was still possible, rejected the Russian offer. They calculated that accepting a formal defense treaty with Moscow would permanently close the door to any rapprochement with Western governments and leave Iran permanently and irreversibly inside the Russian sphere of influence. Israel knows this. Israeli intelligence is sophisticated enough to be aware that no formal mutual defense treaty binds Russia to defend Iran. And that knowledge is part of what has allowed the Israeli military campaign against Iran to proceed as aggressively as it has. Russia has been providing support, intelligence, weapons, targeting data, but it has not been formally obligated to intervene militarily. The absence of a defense treaty has given Israel room to operate that it would not have had if Iran had accepted Moscow's offer. But the Anzali strike changes the calculation potentially permanently, because now Iran, having rejected the mutual defense treaty, having tried to preserve the option of Western engagement, having been bombed repeatedly by Israel and the United States while Russia watched from the sidelines providing unofficial support, is watching Israel strike Russian adjacent infrastructure with apparent impunity. The argument for refusing the mutual defense treaty was that it was unnecessary and strategically limiting. After Anzali, that argument is going to be very difficult to make inside Thrawn. The prediction worth recording now as a matter of verifiable future accountability is this. After this conflict, Iran will seek to revive the mutual defense treaty with Russia that it previously declined, and this time it will accept. Let's look at the broader strategic picture of Israel's current position, because the Caspian escalation makes more sense when understood in the context of a country whose military mythology has been systematically dismantled over the past year and a half. The Iron Dome was supposed to be impenetrable. Iranian strikes have penetrated it multiple times. The 12-day war that preceded this conflict was presented as an Israeli demonstration of decisive air superiority over Iran. The conflict had to end at day 12, not 13, not 14, because the operational reality on the ground and in the air was telling a different story than the narrative of Israeli dominance. The 30-year myth of Israeli military invincibility, built carefully through a combination of genuine capability and strategic communications management, has been exposed as substantially exaggerated by the events of the past several months. Gaza remains unresolved. Hezbollah in Lebanon has inflicted real casualties and demonstrated that the northern border is genuinely vulnerable in ways that Israeli military doctrine had not adequately accounted for. The Houthis have closed the Red Sea to Israeli shipping more effectively than any military operation against Yemen has managed to reopen it. And Iran, the adversary that Israeli and American officials were describing as being reduced to zero military capability, continues to launch strikes, continues to maintain control of Hormuz, and continues to absorb Israeli and American military operations without collapsing. In that context, the Anzali strike looks less like a deliberate strategic masterstroke and more like what it probably is, an act of desperation from a military that has run out of achievable objectives in the immediate theater and is attempting to expand the conflict geographically in ways that might produce outcomes it cannot achieve. Through direct confrontation with the adversaries it has already engaged. The grass-cutting doctrine, periodic strikes to prevent any adversary from becoming too strong does not translate to the Caspian Sea and the Russian strategic space. The rules that apply in Gaza and the West Bank, where the power asymmetry is overwhelming and there is no credible retaliatory threat, do not apply when you are striking infrastructure in Russia's lake. The economic dimension of the Caspian escalation deserves attention because it extends the conflict's costs in a direction that has not been sufficiently analyzed. The north-south corridor that Anzali anchors connects Central Asian commodity exports. Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan are massive oil and gas exporters to global markets through the Caspian and onward. Disrupting this corridor does not just affect Russia and Iran. It affects the export capacity of landlocked Central Asian energy producers who rely on the corridor's functionality. It affects the European markets that receive some of those exports. It affects the global price signals for commodities that transit through this routing. And it does so at a moment when global energy markets are already under extreme pressure from the Hormuz situation. If Russia's response to the Anzali strike includes any action that further disrupts Caspian commerce, and Russia has both the motivation and the capability to take such action against third parties as a way of signaling displeasure without directly attacking Israel. The knock-on effects for an already stressed global energy system would be significant and difficult to contain. This is the quality of miscalculation that characterizes the Anzali strike. Not just the immediate military provocation of Russia, but the cascading economic disruptions that any Russian response produces in a global system that is already operating at the edge of its tolerance for supply disruptions. Here is the analytical conclusion that the evidence supports stated plainly. Israel has now struck the Caspian seaport that serves as a critical node in Russian, Iranian military and commercial logistics. It has done so knowing that no formal mutual defense treaty obligates Russia to respond militarily. It has done so as part of a broader pattern of escalation that has taken the conflict from its original stated objectives: Iranian nuclear capability, Hormuz transit, to operations across Lebanon, Yemen, the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and now the Caspian Sea. The pattern is not one of deliberate strategic expansion toward defined objectives. It is the pattern of an actor that cannot achieve its stated objectives and is expanding the geographic scope of the conflict in search of a lever that might produce a different outcome. Russia's response will not be a direct military attack on Israel, not because Russia lacks the capability or the motivation, but because the graduated response options available to Moscow, Syrian airspace closure, S-300 delivery to Hezbollah, enhanced Iran supply, Caspian commercial pressure can impose enormous costs on Israel and its strategic environment without triggering the formal escalation that direct military action would constitute. Russia plays the long game. The response to Anzali will come in forms that are harder to attribute, harder to respond to, and harder to undo than a missile strike, but it will come. And when the S-300 appears in Lebanon, when Hezbollah fires a system that tracks and engages Israeli Air Force aircraft over northern Israel with a precision that Hezbollah's previous air defense capability could not achieve. We will all remember this conversation. We will remember that the path to that moment ran through Anseli, through Israel's decision to strike Russia's lake, through the calculated arrogance of a military that confused the rules that apply to adversaries with no powerful patrons with the rules that apply to the allies of the country that holds more nuclear warheads than the rest of the world combined. This is exactly the kind of analysis that does not exist in Western mainstream coverage in English or in any European language. Not because the analysis is difficult, because the analysis leads to conclusions that are uncomfortable for the official narrative that Western media operates within. Subscribe to this channel now. Share this video with everyone in your network who deserves to understand the full strategic picture of what is happening. Join us live Monday through Friday. We will see you in the next